This is the first video in the course on cognition model development. In this video, I'm going to give you an introduction to cognition model development. Of course, as is the case with all videos, you should have completed the prerequisites for this course. One of those that's very important is the course on composing units. In that course, I give a good introduction to cognition models from a user standpoint and the role that they play in flame scenarios. So I'm assuming that you already have that basic understanding, so I'm not going to go into all of that all over again. Also, one of the prerequisites is the entity model development course. And cognition models are entity models, so everything that was stated in that course and taught in that course applies to cognition models. So I'm not going to go over all that again either. So if you haven't watched all the prerequisites, especially the two that I just mentioned, it's important that you watch those. Now for this course, I'm going to be using a scenario, and I'll be adding to it throughout the course. So I want to go ahead and create that, and I'd like you to go ahead and create it as well. So if you'll be logged in to Forge as your individual user and open a scenario and go to the Flames example scenarios and open up the tutorial no units scenario. And when you're asked to log in as Flames examples, say no. So we are going to create a very simple unit in this scenario. So first thing I want to do, if you'll go to the equipment menu and select sensors, and we're going to create a new sensor meta object. I'm not going to use the FEX radar that we used in the composing units course. We're going to create a meta object that is of this EXM sensor class. This is the same class that was used for the entity model development course. So we're just going to call this EXM sensor, and I'm going to create a new data set. Because I can't save it in the data set owned by Flames 21 examples, and I'm going to hit accept. As you remember, you have to have some kind of text in here so that configuration will pass. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this data set right away as cognition development. You can call it anything you want. And I copied that into the paste buffer because I'm going to use that name a couple more times. Now go to parameters and select cognition models, and we're going to create a meta object that belongs to the EXM cognition, which is one of the model that we're going to be using for most of this course. So create a new data set, select a class EXM cognition. I'm just going to name it the same as the name of the class, EXM cognition, and hit accept. This cognition model doesn't have any input parameters. And then I'm going to save this data set, and I'm going to also call it cognition development. And then I'm going to save the overall scenario, and it prompts me for a name, and I'm going to call that scenario cognition development scenario data set. So now I have my own scenario with a couple of extra meta objects. And then with that, I'm going to create a unit that uses those two meta objects. So I'll create a new unit here. I'm going to call it test unit. And then over in the script tab, I'm going to attach those two meta objects. So I'm going to say employ sensor. And I'm going to pick that new sensor meta object that I just created and hit a semicolon and a return. And then I'm going to employ a cognition model, and I'm going to browse and select the one that I just created, the EXM cognition. going to hit a semicolon, then I'm going to do start 0 and hit accept. So now I've got a test unit, and you can see from the composition it has two models on it, a sensor model and a cognition model. Then I'm going to go over here to the commands tab, and I'm going to add a command. Now this particular cognition model only has one visible command. It has 3 total commands, but the other 2 are internal. So we'll talk about those a little bit later. So I'm going to double click on that. It expects a search range, so I'm going to specify the search range in kilometers, and I'm going to make it 10 kilometers. So this has a little scenario set out. Let me go ahead and save again. Let's see. Oh, it's asking for the name of the unit data set, so I'm going to make that cognition development as well. So here's my scenario. Got a unit with 2 models on it, 1 command, and I'm ready now to start talking about and introduce you to cognition model development. This particular scenario that I just created is the scenario that we're going to be using mostly through the rest of this course, so we'll be adding to it. In the rest of this video and in a couple of the other videos, you'll see in the video that the owner of the data set is something different, and it's just an untitled data set. So when I first made some of these videos, I was just using some temporary untitled data sets, and so that particular set of data sets shows up in the video. Don't let that confuse you. It's the same unit, the same composition, and you should be using this scenario that you just created. So with that, let's take a look at the source code of this EXM cognition model. But before I look at the code, I just want to show you that this model really doesn't do much of anything. So I'm going to hit play, and I'll pause it right away. So I'm getting some output from that sensor model, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the output that I'm interested in here most is this little command, this little output right here that it says. It's a little print statement, FMH announce call that's just saying I am the assess routine is executing, and it has an input value here called search range, and I set to 10 kilometers, which is 10,000 meters. So it's just showing that it was able to successfully retrieve that value, and it prints it out. And what this particular cognition model does, this process method does for the assess command, is it takes that value and it initiates engage. Actually, it doesn't take that value. It goes to the sensor and gets a value, and it initiates engage, and it passes that value to the sensor. Passes that value to the engage process method for the engage command. And that's an internal command that doesn't show up when we are on the user interface. It's a command that can't be initiated as a part of the scenario development. It's something called an internal command that can only be initiated internally. So that's it. That's all that this model does. I don't even have a platform model on it, so I can't position it on the screen. I'm going to show you where the other output's coming from too, the sensor model. And this is not an entity related thing, which is why it wasn't covered in the entity developer's manual. This is a sensor specific thing. Sensors have a detect method. And so each time that detect method is being called, we're getting a little print statement inside of there as well, just to tell us that the methods are being called. So all this output is doing is just letting us know that methods of our models are being called. 2 methods for the cognition model and that 1 detect method for the sensor model. So now we're ready to go take a look at the source code to that cognition model. And you should already have your Visual Studio solution set up. We've been using it for the entity model development tutorials, the videos. And so here's our F-tutorial project. And here's the cognition folder. I've got multiple cognition models here, and we're going to take a look at some of those. Well, actually, we have already used those in the user training. We took a look at those other models. We're going to look at this EXM cognition model, and it's a real simple model, as I've mentioned before. So first we'll look at the the include file, and you'll see that the definition of this class, except for the fact that it's inheriting CPP cognition rather than sensor, it looks very much like the include file for any other entity model. We declare our default structure. We have our own little local input values. And by the way, I'll go back to Forge here. This particular cognition model, EXM cognition, doesn't have any input parameters at all. So we don't have a user interface. We don't have any data that we have to write out to the Flames database, any parameter values. The only methods that we're implementing, we're not doing a query, we're not doing any of the other attribute methods, we're not doing any IO or UI. We just have a clone and configure. And you already know what those two methods do, so we won't spend a lot of time on that. We have a create method, just like all entity models do. We do have a template file. We have to have a template file, but the template file is empty, so I'll go take a quick look at that. There's nothing in it. We just have a layout here for the basic structure of the Bob lists. So if somebody wanted to make a copy of this and they wanted to add some parameter values to it on the user interface, it's all set up to be able to do that. And then we have the constructor and destructors like we always have. We have the class initialize functions like we always have. And then this is something that is unique to cognition models. There's a couple of process method declarations right here. We are going to get to those in great detail in the upcoming videos. Let's take a quick look at the overall base methods for this class. Constructor, destructor, class initialize. These are all the same, the base methods. We do define a database record, but just like that template file, we just say there are no fields in it. So even though we're not saving anything to the database, we still have to define the database record. And as is the rule, the convention, the database record is defined using the class abbreviation, which is the same name that we use when we're defining the top level Bob list for the class. So that's a convention that's important. And then we have this little call right here called define prototypes, and that is calling some code that was auto-generated by the prototype editor, and we're going to talk about that in great detail a little bit later in these videos. We have a clone method, same as the clone method. We have a configure. There's no input, so the configure method doesn't do anything. Here's the create method. Looks just like a basic create method. So this is just a very simple, looks very much like the base methods of the EXM sensor. So that's actually all that I want to talk to you about, all I want to tell you about in this introduction. Just wanted to get you familiar with the overall structure and show you what the model does when it's running in a scenario. So this concludes the introduction to cognition models, and we will start looking at the details of cognition models a little bit more in the upcoming videos. Thank you for listening, and thank you for using Flames.